Let's go ahead and take a look at the internet weather over the last week or so here. And we'll start out here with some activity. You mentioned this earlier when you were talking about the Akamai State of the Internet report. Scan probes, actually scan sources and probes on port 5000 TCP. Again, this is associated with the Synology disk station manager here. And this was actually a new scan activity that was initiated on July 4th. Actually, it looked like it was initiated at basically 0000 hours on July 4th Eastern time. Although in UTC it kind of showed a little bit later than that. But the other aspect of this, I wanted to just put it into perspective. That looked like a big jump in activity, but when we look back over the last 180 days of activity, you can see the sort of the life cycle of this. And we've talked about this sawtooth pattern where it's clearly a botnet that's being told, lots of IP addresses being told to go out and do the scanning activity. And then over time, different bots are able to complete their task earlier than others. And so you see this decay in the participation in that scanning activity. And then finally, the botnet operator initiates a new command. What this looks like to me is, well, we had basically a 6-week hiatus in activity that is initiating new commands. Now, part of it was that there was some public disclosure about this activity, and so the actor may have decided to lay low for a little bit. Part of it may be that they're just really doing maintenance activity on the botnet. That is, they've been able to establish a reasonable number of bots, and over time you start to lose them. You know, they may have had a thunderstorm and it reset the device, and so they lose access to it, and so they need to restore that access. So it looks like they're basically in maintenance mode on this. Again, may have laid low for a little bit until the news of this sort of got out of the mainstream media. But it's definitely back. And I just thought I'd share a little bit about what it looks like geographically where these are, and clearly it is all over the world. There seems to be kind of a heavy concentration in China, perhaps even the heaviest in Europe, but all over the place. United States, South America, Europe, even little smatterings in Africa just a little bit there. China and India are showing some hot spots associated with this. Next item here is scan sources on port 443 TCP. That's HTTPS, or encrypted web access. We talked about this last time. It hasn't changed at all, really. There's not really any significant change. We're showing 30 days of activity here where we have a huge increase in the number of source addresses that are scanning on port 443. This is not new activity. We had reported on this. In fact, last week's we showed a longer time period, which showed the previous activity taking place as well. For the most part, this activity is originating out of Argentina. Again, I thought it would be useful to take a look at it from a geographic point of view. I want to point out significance here is that this chart does not reflect the amount of probing activity from any one of these points. What it's reflecting is the concentration of sources at one of those points. And the reason that's significant is really the majority of probes on this port are coming out of the United States. In fact, they're coming out of a sort of a known research source that we feel is probing for Heartbleed and still continuing to do probing to look for that activity, whereas the most sources are concentrated out of Argentina and not associated with Heartbleed. We think there's a different purpose associated with that. Next item here is scan probes on port 53 TCP, that's DNS, and we've been reporting on this one for some time as well. Most of the probes are coming from a single address in China. It seems to consistently still be the case. This is automated activity. It has a very regular daily routine that it's going through. They may be attempting to do zone transfers. I suspect that this is basically just trying to map the domain space of the internet to the best of their capability. Looking at the most probe ports, this is actually probably very similar in terms of how we gather this data. We talked a little bit about the differences, but similar to what the Akamai report is reporting on. But there are some differences clearly from what the first quarter 2014 report from Akamai says and what this specific day says here. In particular, at the top of the list, we see port 22 TCP. We're going to take a little bit of a closer look at that. Port 135 TCP following that. And then port 80 TCP has moved up several notches, or 4 notches, relative to the top 10 from last week. Next is port 445 TCP that has not changed in terms of its ranking. And we see port 5000, we already looked at the activity associated with that. That moved up 44 slots relative to other ports and the scanning activity that's taking place, followed by port 23 TCP, port 1433 TCP, 88 TCP, 3389 TCP, and then last but not least, 53 UDP. And the next chart here, as I said, we'd take a look at and what we're looking at here is actually the last 365 days, the last year of activity associated with port 22 TCP. The significance here is there is clearly an upward trend that's been taking place over the last year. So whereas at the beginning of last year we saw on the order of about perhaps, in a bad period of time, 25 million scan probes in the hour. Now it's regular to see on the order of 275 as high as 300 million probes in a given hour. So we've seen about a tenfold increase in probes on port 22 TCP in the last year. And as we've said several times before, this is most likely indicative of targeting the Internet of Things that have exposed access to these ports and default passwords and brute force password guessing activities going on against those. Next item here, scan probes on port 135 TCP, as that was second ranked in our top 10 ports. And we've been reporting on this one for some time as well, showing 60 days of data. It is at a lower level than we had seen previously, so that's good news. But this appears to be pretty much instigated by a single actor here for some really strange but most likely nefarious purposes. Next item here is most sources doing probing, and at the top of the list, port 443 TCP, we've already talked about that one, followed by port 445 TCP. And we show, and actually I tend to jump over this, I wanted to at least mention it, we show icmp type 3, and that actually is an indicator of destination unreachable. And we generally don't talk about that from a security standpoint. Oftentimes it does have some security ramifications associated with it, but there are a number of factors that can influence it. It could be backscatter from a denial of service attack. It could be scanning activity against IP addresses that aren't answering or are answering that the destination's unreachable. So there are a lot of different causes. It's a little difficult to sort out which is which, so we generally sort of skip over those. The next port here, port 80 TCP, 23 TCP, 8080 TCP, and then followed by some ports that are most likely innocuous, that is 27015, which is most likely associated with gaming activity, and 3128. I think, John, you mentioned this is associated with a proxy application, is that right? Yeah. So that may have some nefarious intent behind it, and then followed by 8081 TCP.
We haven't seen the zero access
P2P
right?
ports.
I always get them mixed up in my head. But yeah, zero access peer-to-peer stuff we haven't seen in a while.
Yeah, it has been diminishing over time.
Yeah.
And so that's a positive thing. And I think part of the influence here is that there are some others that are so overwhelming that it's pushing them out of the top 10. So whereas the diminishing is occurring, it's not as if there's been a big change in the last couple of weeks. So we should perhaps revisit that in the next
picture of that one for
episode,
next
and we
week.
can and show what's going on there. There has been some suggestions that zero access may in fact still be active in doing it. It's mostly associated with click fraud. And there is some infrastructure that's still there. It doesn't appear that there's been any recruiting taking place, but I have gotten some information that suggests perhaps that it's active. So that's one of the things that we'll want to pay attention, perhaps a little closer attention to see where they could potentially be conducting their activities.